So what has it been like, Hazel, being a woman in a critically male environment in this profession? I mean, it must have been tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's not especially that I would call it tougher than the men in some senses. So it is difficult to get into for anyone. And anyone who wants to be in the sport has to be resilient, and you have to be able to, I say that. There's a lot of people who think they have earned their way into the sport and that they have grafted, who have in reality got in on existing nepotism, because, like I said before, there are very few formal paths into motorsport, and that does create opportunities if you are obnoxious enough to ignore the barriers, but it does also just the fact that there are blockades that you need to negotiate, and if you don't have the ability to either understand how to get past them yourself, or the ingenuity or just the sheer bloody mindedness to hop over them and to not wait for an answer. If you don't have people who are pushing them over for you or sort of guiding you around them, then it can be very frustrating and lonely, and like I think that goes for anyone, and there's lots of things that can exclude people from motorsport, so from genders to sexuality to race, class, financial background. It's an expensive thing to work in, whether you're media or a driver, albeit as you can knock a few zeros off the price for media, but it's not. It is exceptionally lonely as the people who are not white straight men in the paddock. I am not the only woman in Formula E. There certainly are others, which is partly why I find Formula E much more enjoyable. I'm quite good friends with some of the Formula E drivers, not in the sense that like we go on holiday together, but in the sense that we'll talk to each other in the paddock, and there will always be the sense that if my male peers had that dynamic with a driver, then they get praised for having such a close relationship and building such strong connections, and I get called unprofessional or that I'm getting inappropriately close with the drivers. Doesn't matter that it's completely innocent, it's just like some stupid joking, or like literally just talking to each other because we see each other for a huge amount of our professional lives. I write articles about them, they read them, we speak to each other regularly in order to do that, but there will always be the implication that I am somewhat of a legitimised fangirl. It's probably the politest word I could put for it. It's unfortunate that there aren't more examples of people who are visible in it, so that you don't get more women who feel completely legitimised in entering. And it's in a lot of senses desperately sad that in 2020, even as somebody who's successful by some metrics at least, I'm the person who was chosen to be the expert about Formula E in a Hollywood film, and I still to some extent feel that I have to prove myself, because there will be that assumption that I'm just there for something that isn't to do with the racing. And Normally I would say a technical journalist. I write much more about the technical side of Formula E than I particularly do the drivers. But there will always kind of be that dynamic. I'm very lucky in that I avoided a lot of the worst of it by coming in old and not, I don't want to say naive, but not really on the radar of a lot of the more exploitative people.
So where do you think FE is going to end up then?
I think Formula E is probably going to get steadily bigger. It's one of, so Formula E has a problem at the moment of almost being too successful.
Right.
In that it had been planning for years almost for its own death. So it had been like so close to financially falling apart, to politically falling apart, to like everything, literally the wheels coming off for so many years. And then it was like season 4, season 5, it kind of came together, and now we're in season 6 is actually in a very solid place, even with everything that's been happening with COVID and stuff. So it's in a position to definitely go up from here. But it needs to do that in a sustainable way, sustainability being important to the championship. But yeah, in a way where it constantly still builds that vulnerability into itself. Like, especially this year, we've seen that sporting championships and entire huge global businesses and like everything, you can't build on the idea of exponential growth forever. And so Formula E has to not get overexcited, because it could still destroy itself. It is still very young, it's still relatively less well established, etc. And if it continues to grow, if it continues to secure new good venues, if it continues to get people to make big environmental commitments, and
to I would say to increase its fan base as well, because I mean it's driven, you know, if you get much more fans, then it there's a reason for it to then stay, isn't there, and to grow.
And to increase the viewership and people who are interested in it. And like I know you know I work in motorsport, but like you watched the film and you saw that it was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic.
And so doing stuff like that is worthwhile.
And I'll put the link below of the film.
But yeah, like I think it's one of those things where it's like once you see it, you're like, okay, there's something interesting here. But it's just a case of making sure that the growth is steady and you're getting people to look at it and you're keeping explaining and you're keeping educating and you're keeping making people curious about it. And that you're reaching the right audiences, that you're making it clear that this is something that is accessible and is, you know, tickets to a Formula E race are like €20. That it's not a huge amount, and like
and
they're in the
out.
city centre. Yeah, and it's one day out. You literally go for one day.
And I think what is good about FE, from everything that you've said, is that, you know, some could say it's more relatable to the man on the street, because his car is, obviously it's not similar, but it's not too dissimilar. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
And I think it would encourage ordinary people, the people who are not into it already, to really take a avid interest into it, especially if they're in the city centres and stuff like that. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, like we had this really controversial race in season 3 in Montreal in Canada, where I mean, definitely one of Formula E's most controversial races ever. It turned out the mayor of Montreal was like misusing city funds to pay for it, and it wasn't Formula E's fault. Like, he was just a corrupt mayor on lots of fronts. But yeah, so there was this sort of big controversy around it, and even when we were in Montreal, it was sort of like there were headlines in the local newspaper where they were like "Le scandale de Formula E," and even with all of that, and they were like, "Oh, you can't close the roads," and you know, everything. And the Formula E cars will pull the roads apart. They didn't, but still, they have in some other places. I want to be clear. But there's this sort of catch fencing that goes up around Formula E, like just wire fences like you get around a building site or whatever. And there were all these local residents who came down to watch Shakedown, which is just the cars doing 3 laps each to check they work and the track works and stuff. And it's a little bit is to get the camera eye in and stuff. And we don't always have it, but we had it in Montreal. And there were all these people, like proper kind of like tiger paws, you know, like kids with their hands on a barrier.
That's
like,
good though, isn't it? Yeah.
And like that's why it's pointful going to city centres, because again, if you put that even on the Montreal street circuit, like the Formula 1 circuit, nobody would know it was even there.
Right.